I wish my parents would come to visit, but unfortunately, no. Mm, sorry, I'm just making sure things are where they should be. Okay. Yeah, it's too far for my parents to fly all the way over from New Zealand. I am sorry that I wigged some of you guys out. I'm not sure if wigged is, that might be a Kiwi word. I worried some of you unnecessarily when I changed the due date on the test. It's because I wanted to make sure it was available and live for all the classes. But to be clear, let me make sure this is recorded. Someone's already done it. Perfect. But to be clear, it is in class on your assigned tutorial. If for some reason you can't attend your assigned tutorial, you need to reach out to me on Teams to make a request for an exemption. Otherwise, we will be starting the test 30 minutes after the start of your tutorial, and it will run, I think it's 35 minutes, and that will be the time that you basically have to complete the test, and there will be no ability to do a makeup after that unless you have extreme kind of circumstances. It is in person. It is closed book. I think maybe some of the Saigon South students had some information about it being closed book, but sorry, open book, but it is closed book. You have to bring your own device. If you don't have a device that you can use, please reach out. You have been given a vignette example. It has been posted on Canvas. It was posted in week 6. Please read it. It is a very lengthy example. If you don't read it before and you don't think about it before, you will waste a lot of time just reading the case study. So please read it before the test. You'll be asked 2 brief questions, and those questions will be focused on ethics. Some students have asked if they can pre-prepare answers. No, that would be stupid, because how do you pre-prepare answers when you don't know what the question is going to be? And students who pre-prepare answers then try and just put those answers into the quiz, and they always get worse grades. So please do not do that. What you need to do is look at the question and think about what are the ethical questions that might be asked about that scenario. So thinking about all the different kind of aspects of ethics that were talked about in this course, how might you answer the question about ethics? It might be something general. Identify one ethical issue that is presented. It might be more specific, right? You learned about X, explain how this applies in this case. So you have to know about all of the different ethical kind of implications, but you can't pre-write a question. For this case study, do we need to learn all the statistics in Dr. Merv's quant studies? No. You don't need to have they're not going to say, Was it 25% or 15%? No, you don't need to know that. For the case study, as we received the content, but I couldn't find the questions. You don't get the questions. That's the thing that I'm trying to explain. The questions are in the test, right? So you can't pre-prepare the answer for it. You have to treat it like um I've got some information, what might they ask me so I can be prepared, but don't just write the answer, because if you just write the answer, then you're going to try and shoehorn it into whatever question, and that doesn't make any sense because um, it might not be accurate. So you're better off to have a general understanding than a specific one. I hope that makes sense. Any other questions? You'll see that there are also multi-choice questions, and that the quiz will be locked with a password. So even when it goes live, you won't be able to see it. You have to use the password to come in. Please make sure that you know how to get onto Canvas, you know your password. You can bring a piece of paper with you to write down ideas, but it has to be blank. You can have a drink with you, but no food, and you can have a pencil or a pen on your table, but no cell phone, no pencil case, nothing like that. Yes, you do get access to the case study during the test. That's a very good question. You absolutely do. Okay. So just a reminder for next week, it'll be a holiday Monday, Thursday, and Friday. So we won't do, oh, this is, I gave you the wrong, I updated, but I've shared the wrong class. So basically, we won't have our normal debrief today, and we won't have the tutorials. So what I will do is I will make a pre-recorded session that you guys can watch, and I'll also provide a drop-in session if you want any support with assignment 2 on Tuesday. So you're more than welcome to drop in. If you want to ask questions about assignment 2, I'll be there. If no one turns up, then that's fine. But it just means that you're not kind of stuck for a whole week, in the week right before your assignments are coming due. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions about next week? So there's no in-person, no debrief, but I will make a recording of the content that you can watch at your leisure. And there'll be a drop-in session that you guys can attend to ask questions about the assignment. Keep an eye on Canvas. I'll put the links on there. So we're going to spend the rest of today's lecture doing a bit of a quick fly through DSM, kind of what are some of the issues with it, but more importantly related to your assignment, looking at the issues around stigma. Are we supposed to attend the sessions for our signed up tutorial slots only? Yes. If you try and attend a different tutorial time, you will not be able to sit the test. You have to attend the assigned tutorial slot. If for some reason you need something different, you must reach out to me at least 24 hours beforehand. Otherwise, we'll assume that you're a non-attender. Okay, so um, human behavior naturally varies, right? And in the 1800s, 1900s, we started this idea around using the normal distribution curve to be able to uh, think about the range of human behavior. And so we would say the vast majority of people show kind of average behavior, and a smaller percentage as we go out to the extremes show more desirable versions of this behavior and less desirable versions of this behavior. And indeed, this is how we presented things like IQ, right? With average IQ being 100, those with higher IQ being considered brighter or smarter, and those with lower IQ being considered lesser, right? So at the time that IQ was first discussed, we would be talking about those with the upper end of this being more desirable, so being geniuses, and those down the bottom being less desirable. Morons and idiots is originally what the diagnostic term was used. But what's the potential issue with this conceptualization of behavior? Anyone think of any issues? We're saying everyone falls on this curve. Yeah. Expectations around uh, if they're really part of the normal community and what does it mean to be normal, right? So we see really quickly that what this kind of thinking does is allow for labels and then generalization. So we see stereotypes around things like mental illness. We see it being used for justification around saying that someone is dangerous and that we need to avoid them, and that they're not really fit to be in normal society. The other thing that it does is it can set us up in a situation where while you can maybe be in the more desirable end for certain behaviors, you can be in the less desirable end for other behaviors. So, for example, people who have very high IQ may have very low EQ, right? So they are exceptionally bright and smart, genius, whatever the term you want to use. But in terms of relating to people, they sometimes struggle. And so it's not necessarily um, representative of kind of a whole person and a holistic view of kind of what it means to be human. And it can be really reductionist. Um, the biggest issue, though, is around the fact that we often, instead of using these labels where people are down the tail end of the less desirable as a way to say, hey, look, these people need more support, we often use it as a way to exclude them. So, psychologists have often have issues around precise definitions when it comes to abnormal behavior. And this is because what is considered normal and abnormal is culturally bound, right? I think it's abnormal that Vietnamese people try to get into a lift before the people have gotten out of the lift, right? But every time I say this, Vietnamese people look at me like I'm crazy, like they haven't even noticed that they do it, right? I'm pretty sure that this is pathological. I'm not, right? But the point being that culturally this is abnormal. Um, a a Vietnamese person challenging their boss directly and openly saying that they think their idea is stupid, would potentially be considered abnormal, right? Whereas maybe in a Western context, that's not considered abnormal. And so when we talk about abnormal behaviors, we're talking about patterns, thoughts, or feelings of behaviors that cause people to experience distress, and it prevents them from functioning in their daily lives, right? So the point being, it has to cause the person themselves distress and have an impact. We tend to talk about disorders rather than disease. And this is because we're kind of moving away from that medical model, right? We're not kind of saying it's something specific. Rather, what we're looking for are these patterns. So we're looking for patterns that refer to looking for kind of statistical collections of symptoms that go together, right? So it's not a single incident or one symptom, it's a clustering around this. So, for example, one of the symptoms of brain cancer can be having a headache. If you have a headache, though, you don't necessarily have brain cancer, right? There's lots of different reasons for why you might have a headache. It's the same for depression, right? Just because you're feeling a bit sad doesn't mean to say that you have major depression. What we want to see in order to be diagnosed with major depression is, okay, we want to see, yes, feelings of sadness, but we want to see changes in appetite, changes in sleeping, changing in socializing behavior. These are all examples of kind of the patterns that we look for. And so when we're talking about patterns, we're really talking about behaviors, right? This could be to do with our thoughts, our feeling, our perceptions, or our actual overt behaviors. To be clear, abnormality is generally not a legal concept used in courts to assess the responsibility. Abnormality is a legal concept that's used to assess legal responsibility. So if we think back to the forensic session, there's a point at where we say people who are sitting down this end of this normal distribution are not accountable for their behaviors because they are so far from normal intelligence that they can't understand. Um, Often within psychology, people will talk about the 4Ds. So dysfunctional, it interferes with a person's ability to be able to live their life. Distressful, it causes emotional or physical pain and suffering to either the person or themselves. Dangerous, it can harm themselves or others. Deviant, it's outside of cultural norms. And so these are kind of a helpful guide to think about, is this actually an abnormal behavior, right? But it's not essential and it's definitely not diagnostic criteria. Um, the reason I like this is that it forces us to pull back into thinking about, for whom is this a problem? So, for example, if we think about something like schizophrenia, someone can hear voices, but if it doesn't impact upon their daily life, if they're not suffering in any way, if those voices aren't threatening for them to hurt themselves, right? Then even if it is outside of cultural norms, it's not really a problem. Similarly, if someone is has lost a loved one, it's not unusual, right, in terms of cultural norms, to not be able to function initially after that loss. It is not unusual to see suffering and pain after that loss. So these would be considered culturally normal responses. If, however, someone was threatening to harm themselves or others as a result of that, then absolutely you've got an issue. So this can be a way of kind of just thinking through how big an issue is this? How much concern is there around this behavior? Where are we going? So if we look at most functional and dysfunctional behaviors, what we see is that indeed it's a continuum. So if we take something like mourning, being sad and upset would be considered appropriate and normal. In a Western context, continuing to mourn or be kind of in a dysfunctional state more than 6 months later would be considered a concern potentially, right? Because it's starting to become dysfunctional. And so this is an example of substance use where drinking alcohol in lots of cultures is considered normal. There's not considered a dysfunction around it. The point at where it becomes dysfunctional is when you start not being able to turn up to work, right? When you start maybe having fights, when you start spending your money on it instead of on important aspects to do with your family. When it starts having a physical impact upon your health, you start getting cirrhosis of the liver, right? When you start losing relationships. And so along this continuum, people will sit in different places. But interestingly, what would be considered socially appropriate will change as well. So it can be really hard to get alcohol abuse support in Vietnam because it's often just seen as drinking, right? Whereas maybe if you lived in a culture where alcohol use was far more restricted, then that point at where you're saying it's dysfunctional would be less. Does that make sense? Without seeing your faces, I don't know if I'm making sense to you guys. Yep. Okay. So, because I work in disabilities, I'm going to use autism as an example, right? So often people talk about autism spectrum disorder, right? That's its technical term. And they talk about level 1, level 2, level 3, right? This idea of somehow being more or less autistic. People will often say things like, yeah, but aren't we all a little bit autistic? This is quite dismissive of people's lived experience of having autism. Because if we go back to thinking about the impact on people's lives, then, the fact that when I was a kid, I really liked to make sure that my pegs were matching when I hung out the clothes. Sure, that shows a trait around kind of rigidity, but it didn't impact upon my life, right? It didn't impact upon my social interactions. And so if you hear this, try and dissuade this statement because it's generally, yeah, just the community feel that it's dismissive of their experience. And part of the reason that it's seen as being dismissive is that actually autism is far from kind of having one trait that we're looking at in terms of fitting within the norms of society. And so you see here that there's 10 traits here that, or 10 aspects of someone's life. And within that, you can sit from functional to dysfunctional. And so someone whose autism is impacting more on their life would have more of these segments completely filled. Someone whose autism is impacting less on their life would maybe have less of these segments filled. Or they might have one segment really filled and then others not full at all, right? But if you only have one of these segments filled, so for example, depression is completely full, but you don't present with any of these other traits, not even the little inside circles, then you probably don't have autism, you probably have depression. Does that make sense? So I think we need to move away from this idea that autism is this linear spectrum. Indeed, what we see is that there's a lot of different behaviors that come into it, and the extent to which someone can mask or manage these behaviors will often then change how much we as neurotypicals see someone as presenting with autism. So when someone says things like, oh, but you don't seem autistic, that's often because someone has put in ways of managing these areas. And what people don't see is the work and effort that goes into that. So a bit of a note about the DSM. So the DSM was basically created as a way of being able to diagnose abnormal behavior. It was created by mental health professionals, predominantly psychiatrists, and it was designed so that we could provide better treatment, right? The idea that if you could get the correct diagnosis, then you could provide targeted therapies. Um, when it first came out, there were a lot of hypothetical constructs, but we knew that these aren't particularly reliable when it comes to creating a measurement. And so from the DSM-3 onwards, we saw this shift to statistical likelihood. So the idea, an autistic, if you're going to be diagnosed with autism, then you should show X, Y, and Z behaviors because a significant percentage of the population who present with this behavior. So statistics were seen as being more reliable, but there's still questions around the validity and appropriateness of the categorization and labeling that comes from the DSM. Indeed, the first lot of challenges to the DSM came in the 60s and 70s when there was a group within psychiatry who were saying, like, there's no such thing as a mental health disorder. It's just this variation in human behavior that we need to kind of consider as normal. And there's absolutely elements of this that we need to, I guess, take into consideration because there are benefits to getting a label, but there are also problems. And I'm going to talk about that in the rest of today's class. So basically, when we're now up to DSM-5, and what we need to recognize is that while the creation came out of a good intent, right, wanting to be able to provide better services, its creation wasn't contingency free. So if we look at the DSM-5, as we were like, it was being created when the DSM was first created, it was kind of this focus on providing better services. But when the DSM-5 was created, there was a lot of pressure from in the community because there was this move from of deinstitutionalization. So there was a move from the community to want to know whether this was just normal distress within a mental health context or was really problematic. Along with that, we saw pressures from pharmaceutical companies. So diagnosis in the DSM is often used as a justification for being able to access medication. So if we take something like ADHD, you have to have a diagnosis before you can get Ritalin, right? And so what we saw was that a lot of disorders that were being researched or the symptoms were being investigated were clearly linked to pharmaceutical companies. And so what we've seen is an expansion of disorders, not necessarily because it results in better treatment, but because it makes people feel better, and that, they can kind of get these labels. And the flip of that is that it allows pharmaceutical companies to market drugs. I don't necessarily say better, but more effectively in terms of selling more medication. So what are some of the major issues that we see? Well, the big issue is that it is still incredibly Western focused, and I would even argue US specific focus. So if you think about those cultural dynamics, the emic and the etic influences on culture, we see that the DSM is absolutely emic derived from the US, but it tends to be imposed irrespective. So if we take something like eye contact, which is often used as a diagnostic aspect around autism, then in Asian culture, this would seem weird, right? Yet in a Western context, that seems normal. Rigidity to time, right? In some cultures, that's normal. In some cultures, that's not normal. What we're seeing is when it comes to its use, we're seeing this move away from kind of an empirical base to some sort of intuitive clinical considerations rather. So it's being used as a political document rather than as a scientist or a diagnostic tool. There's a failure to appreciate individual differences. So we see this a lot with the way in which diagnoses are often the male version. I'm going to talk about this with regard to autism. We see the increasing range of diagnoses that are being provided and the overlap between them that makes it unclear. What we see is that in the United States in particular, certain diagnoses will be able to be funded under insurance and others won't. And so you'll have very similar diagnoses, but they'll be called a different name because it's funded under that insurance system. We see overdiagnosis. So what would have been just considered part of the normal range of kind of quirky life is now pathologized. So we see this a lot with autism, the person who was just that quirky guy who kind of like trains a bit too much, now is getting a diagnosis. Now there's pros and cons to this. Which I'll talk about before the end of today's class. Um, so if we look, for example, at diagnosis of autism, using the current diagnostic criteria in the DSM, we see that children diagnosed with ASD, 75% are male, 25% are female. That's the current stats. But what we know is that there's a gender bias. So when a 2015 study basically asked clinicians to diagnose case studies, and they found that clinicians, if you removed the gender in a lot of cases, there would be variations in kind of how these presented. So with autism, the way that a female presents with autism looks different to how a male presents with autism, and the assumptions we make about why that behavior presents is different. And so when I was training, we would often hear things like, girls with autism are diagnosed less often, so it doesn't present as often, but when they're diagnosed, they tend to be more severe. What it turns out was we were actually probably missing the large proportion of females because of assumptions we were making around socialization. The DSM is sometimes completely wrong. We pathologize behaviors that later as a society we consider to be normal. So if we take LGBTQI plus populations, homosexuality is no longer named in the DSM. Historically, homosexuality was identified as a disorder. What we see now is that people with different sexual orientations or identities are still included in the DSM-5, but it's under gender dysmorphia. So this new label talks about the emotional and psychological distress associated with sexual and gender identity issues. So it's focusing on the distress related to the dysmorphia rather than the dysmorphia itself. But historically, what we saw was a general intolerance to this idea that there would be sexual attractions outside of those cultural norms. And so people were labeled homosexuals as abnormal, pathological, deviant. And indeed, in the 1950s, the American Psychiatric Association made that discrimination explicit against homosexuals in official documentation. It classified homosexuality as a mental health disorder. Now, this obviously has a huge impact upon the community in terms of thinking about whether you're part of the normal society, right? If we think about that stigma that we talked about what's normal and abnormal. And it's not really until through the 60s and 70s we're seeing kind of pushback against this, but it's not really until the 90s and indeed into the 2000s that we start to see the normalization around homosexuality. It was not okay to be gay before that time. And indeed, the fact that it was labeled as a mental health disorder gave society, parents, church groups a reason to send young people to therapies that were highly detrimental. So we saw people being sent to conversion therapy. And this was, has been well documented to be highly problematic. And this is definitely one of the concerns around the DSM. So this pathologizing of normal behaviors it results in misuse of funds, right? It results in people being subjected to treatments that they don't necessarily need to be subjected to. And this is particularly problematic because the DSM discriminates against minority groups. So if you're female, if you're an ethnic minority, if you're lower class, if you're elderly, if you're gender or sexual minorities, if you're not kind of from the dominant group, then you're considered abnormal. And remember that the vast majority of people who are deciding these diagnoses are Western men, middle to upper class. And so their concept of normal and abnormal varies considerably. I just can see there's a comment. Let me go and read it. Bad fact, conversion therapy still operates in a kind of legitimate practice in some US states today and is still legal within even the US, though some states have banned professionals from practicing conversion therapy. Yeah, absolutely. The conversion therapy. So New Zealand banned it and apologized for it a few years ago. But within the United States, absolutely, it's still utilized and legal in some states. In Vietnam, it has been stopped, I believe. But in some cases, it's still being done just under a different guise and a different name. And so I think that we have to be really careful about these implications. When we pathologize something, when we say that something is disordered, often what we do is we end up blaming the person for their behavior, right? Rather than saying how as a society can we support them. So if we take a diagnosis, like one of the neurodivergent diagnoses, for example. What I know, having talked to a large number of the community, is that when they get their autism, ADHD, dyslexia diagnosis, in lots of ways it's relieving because it allows them to find people that are like themselves. But it also allows them to understand they're not broken, right? Understand that there's a reason that other people sometimes seem to get it easier or faster than them, that they're not stupid or dumb. But the problem is that it can also lead to these assumptions and it can lead to this stigma. So, for example, I worked with a young boy with dyslexia, and the teacher was like, oh, he can't spell because he has dyslexia. No, we just need to teach him differently. So we changed the way in which we were teaching him, and lo and behold, he got up to the same speed of spelling as his classmates. We just had to teach him differently. Oh, they're autistic, so they need visuals. Okay, well, we know that autistic people often do learn visually, and that a higher proportion of them do like visuals, but not every autistic person needs that, right? So we make these generalizations and we have these stigma. Here in Vietnam, the idea that autistic people are dangerous is definitely one of the ones that I see. Is he going to have a meltdown and break everything? And I'm like, no, he's really chill. Like I was trying to get support someone to get a job, right? And this is because the label doesn't always come with great awareness. And so when we talk about stigma, it's basically the disapproval of and or the discrimination against a person based on some perceivable characteristic. And it's basically something that distinguishes them from what would be considered general society. When we talk about stigmas, often they'll be related to cultural race, gender, intelligence, or some sort of health issue. Within psychology, we talk a lot about mental health problems. To be clear, all cultures stigmatize, right? Some people do it, some cultures do it more than others. The types of stigmatization varies within cultures depending on what that normal and abnormality. But stigma exists no matter what. So if we take albinism, so being an albino, right? In some cultures, they would be outcast because they're thought to bring bad luck. They would be ostracized. They might be killed because they're seen as bringing bad luck to the village. In other cases, they might be seen to have magical powers, and therefore they would be held like in esteem. In some cases, they would be seen to have magical powers, and therefore they would be killed because the medicine men would want to get certain parts of their body, right? So this is an example of a physical trait. It's exactly the same with mental health. So people who have seizures, in some cases, and like so auditory hallucinations, right? They might be seen as speaking to kind of other realms and held up in esteem, or they might be seen as having a mental health disorder that and ostracized because they're not part of normality. And so you can have kind of the labeling of this or the stigma around it will vary. The problem that we have around mental health in Vietnam is this stigma can impact upon how we go about supporting people to reach out for treatment. So if we look at kind of this change, if we look at different disorders and kind of the theories that underlie them, what we see is that over time we see changes. So if we look at something like homosexuality, it was seen as deviating from normal, right? And someone who engaged in that was highly stigmatized. They could end up in jail, they could, in some countries, be put to death. In the DSM-2, so around about 18 years later, we see that homosexuality moves from being a sociopathic disorder to being a sexual orientation disturbance. So it's still seen as abnormal, right? But it's now not seeing it's being differentiated away from kind of these personality disorders. Still stigmatized, but maybe starting to be less seen as a mental health disorder as and more of a sexual biological aspect to things. In the 1980s, we start to see the focus not being on being less on the sexual orientation and more on what is the mental health implications of this, right? So anxiety, not being comfortable with oneself. But what you see here is that this can really clearly leave open the space for moving to conversion therapy. When this is revised, in the late 80s, it's now removed as a mental health disorder. Then we see it come back in the DSM-4 as a gender identity disorder, but its focus is on the distress caused by that. So it's completely flipped at the point that it comes in. Sorry, I can just see someone put a thing in. I think China used to consider homosexuality as a mental disorder, but they removed it from their diagnostic manual in 2001, so quite recently. Yeah, absolutely. And there's still Russia. I think it's still considered, it's definitely still illegal in Russia, but I think it's still considered a mental health disorder. But I could be wrong about that. But I know that definitely in some parts of the world. It's definitely still illegal, and it's definitely mental health is kind of used as a way of leveraging it to say this is the reason it's abnormal. Even without the diagnosis stigma that we see occurring now with in the DSM with homosexuality. Homosexuality is a risk indicator for high rates of psychological distress and mental health disorders. So the question though becomes, is this because there's some correlation, right, between being homosexual and having poor mental health? Or is it that because as a society we're still not accepting, and therefore we see higher rates of things like depression as a result, because you have to hide some aspect of yourself, because while it's not a mental health disorder, it's still not fully accepted. So my argument would be that it's the latter, that stigma is creating the mental health, not that being homosexual makes you more susceptible, for example, to depression. Labels have a massive impact. They impact the way that the public labels things, the way that they stereotype things, the focus on something being negative versus positive. And then we end up in like kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in which we say, well, you have something that's wrong with you, therefore you're not normal, therefore you can't do things that normal people do, therefore you don't get a job, right? And therefore people with mental health disorders can't contribute to society, right? And then the stereotype starts fulfilling itself. The other thing that we see, so that's when kind of the public does it, but we also see self-stigma occurring. So we see this occur when someone has a label. So my nephew did this to me. Initially, he said to me, so he has a diagnosis of dyslexia, and he said to me, Auntie Kat, just because I've got dyslexia doesn't mean I'm dumb and stupid. It just means that my brain works differently, right? Which is great. This is stopping self-stigma. But he then also tried to use his diagnosis as an excuse to not do things. So he said, I can't unpack the dishwasher because I got dyslexia, right? It became a reason for him to not do something when actually he was just being straight out lazy. And so it's not just society that kind of limits us based on a diagnosis. It can be ourselves too if we're not careful and aware of it. So some of the challenges, public stigma within society means that we get stereotypes, so negative beliefs about a group. We get prejudice, so agreements with that belief or a negative emotional reaction. So basically you want to stay away. We see discrimination where people won't employ people from those groups. We see, as a result, isolation, alienation, and lack of engagement within society. More indirectly, what we see is that when someone has especially self-stigma, that they will perpetuate what they think they deserve. So, for example, if they believe that a stereotype is like my nephew, I won't go to university because I've got dyslexia, and people with dyslexia don't achieve well, right? This is a self-fulfilling prophecy that then starts to impact upon their lives. So what are some strategies that we can do? Well, we can have community groups, and this is around making sure that we're having better representation around mental illness. We're challenging the stigmas. We're changing what they represent. This has been done really effectively and is how the homosexuality diagnosis was removed, but it's been done highly effectively for autism, for example, where there's kind of been a push back against what autism looks like in a Western context. Education, so making sure that information is available to people so they can be informed. Contact. So what we see is that when there was deinstitutionalization took place, that actually just the contact of people, having kids with disabilities in your schools, having the full spectrum of humanity able to be engaged with decreases stigma. And that integration of people within our society shows that everyone has a benefit. I'm not sure. I'm not sure our families' perception changed though, or rather, would adults allow their families to enter more open-minded healthcares? Yeah, this is an interesting thing, right? I think that it takes a few generations for stigma to change, right? And you find that normally you can see a change in stigma within kind of 2 generations. So if we look at it, if my parents would have been born in the 1960s, so just post that first kind of formal diagnosis, homosexuality was still considered deviant. And my parents would, I would say, would be accepting around homosexuality, but maybe aren't 100% comfortable, don't 100% see it as part of kind of the normal fabric of society, right? But for me, I would say I see it as normal, but growing up, maybe not, right? So I grew up in the 80s, so I grew up in the HIV scare period. So it was still, for me as an adult, I'm accepting, but for me as like a teenager growing up, I would say that it was still seen as um maybe not abnormal, but not normal, right? So it wasn't seen as deviant, but it wasn't seen as being normal. Whereas I look at my nieces and my nephews, and homosexuality or gender identity kind of has very little part to play in their life. Don't get me wrong, there's still a lot of kids who will struggle with the process of coming out, but I think there's a lot more kids who are open a lot younger now about their homosexuality. Recognizing that Vietnam went through this process maybe 20 years after we saw it happening in New Zealand, I have hope that we will see similar changes happen in Vietnam, where kind of the everyday stigmatizing language that we see will stop. So final thoughts. For me, this comes down to the medical model versus the social model. We don't want to say that people are disordered, that they are broken, right? What we really want to say is someone sits upon this continuum. And the point at where it's problematic for them, then we as a society need to be able to provide supports to make sure that we improve outcomes for people. I'm 4 minutes over, guys. But if you have any questions about your assignments, throw them in the chat. I'll answer them later. Otherwise, feel free to come to the drop-in session. Keep an eye on Canvas for the announcement for the times and dates. I'll see you guys later. Bye.